All right, so nice to meet you all. Thank you for coming. Like David said, my name is Sarah. Today I'm terrible at coming up with talk titles, so this is just called Adapting for AI, but hopefully it'll become clear what I'll be speaking about. All right, is this working? Nice. Okay, so AI has moved from inside the lab into our homes and institutions, and there have been a lot of consequences of this shift. Some of the consequences are on a private sphere through, for example, social media algorithms. Some of the consequences are economic through via these AI supply chains, which I'll be talking about later. Some of what AI has an impact on affects our rights and livelihoods. For example, they intervene on employment decisions. AI poses societal risks via, for example, privacy concerns. And there are also a lot of existential questions that have begun to arise around, for example, AGI. So this is sort of like just the range of types of questions that are really, really interesting and pique my interest in this space. And you might ask, okay, so what? There are a lot of, these types of forces that are going to be hard to reel in and pull back from. And in many ways, change is good. So my, argument would be that what's important is that we adjust our understanding of AI as it's integrated into society, and we simultaneously adjust our understanding of society as it integrates AI. And this is what we're going to do today. We're going to try to examine both perspectives. The first part of the talk will be on AI supply chains, and that's going to look at, how we can adjust our understanding of AI as it integrates into society. And then we'll shift to understanding procedure in law, so looking at evidentiary burdens in legal cases against AI decisions, and that's more on the side of understanding, adjusting our understanding of society as it integrates AI. And I want to stop here and say that this is new and ongoing work. So the first one is going to be released very soon. The second one is ongoing, and so I very much would love participation in conversations. So feel free to ask me questions anytime. If anything in these slides are unclear, please do interrupt. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about are AI supply chains. And this is joint work with my wonderful collaborators. This was work back at MIT, Aspen Hopkins, Andrew Ilias, Isabella Struckman, Luis Fidegare, and my PhD advisor, Alexander Madri. And I'm continuing work on AI supply chains at Stanford. And so that ongoing work is with Jonathan Xue, Lindsay Gilmard, Daniel Ho, and Percy Leung. Okay, but this is the work that we're going to focus on today, kind of setting the scene of, what are AI supply chains, and understanding the implications on machine learning. And we'll follow this sort of parallel structure. We'll start by introducing what AI supply chains are, and then we'll go through 2 case studies. And in each case study, I'll introduce a sort of small theoretical result and a nice setup, and then some experiments to kind of explore and dig a little deeper. Okay, so what are AI supply chains? AI supply chains are the complex network of AI products and services that integrate and produce AI. So a canonical example that people talk about very, very frequently nowadays is, you have one organization and that organization produces some sort of pre-trained base model. You have a second organization that curates some specialized data set D, and then you have a third organization that fine-tunes that pre-trained base model M on that specialized data set D and produces some fine-tuned model F or something like that. And this is just a very, very kind of simple, tiny 3-node supply chain that we could look at. Questions so far? Okay, and so to give a little context, the formation of AI supply chains has been a long time coming. We sort of have had this tradition of outsourcing ML work, and that has developed over decades. And so I would argue it began mostly with sort of outsourcing of data work. It began with sort of the curation of these large data sets like WordNet and ImageNet, where researchers realized that they could outsource the very expensive process of labeling and curating data and focus more on training and other sorts of innovations. That developed into a sort of industry around Mechanical Turk, and now is a very, very thriving industry. For example, Scale AI does a lot of the data work in the space. This outsourcing of ML work also extended to model training. So it started with transfer learning, this idea that actually we could reduce a lot of the expensive costs of training by looking at pre-trained models and transferring to downstream specialized tasks. And AutoML was a similar movement to extend ML to non-experts. And for the most part, this development was mostly gradual until 2022 with ChatGPT. I think just how accessible it was caused this explosion of AI adoption in industry and led to the emergence very, very quickly of these complex AI supply chains. And in many ways, supply chains is actually good. It signals a healthy growth of industry. It improves efficiency by allowing different individuals, different parties to specialize in specific types of tasks along the ML pipeline. Okay, and there are a lot of implications of AI supply chains. For example, there are works around copyright in AI supply chains. Lee, Cooper, and Grimmelman wrote this piece, I think back originally in 2022. And they explore questions like, how should credit be attributed when there are a lot of different hands involved in the process? How should royalties be distributed? Who has ownership over an AI creation and more? There are questions around supply chain resilience. So if an AI product or service goes down or suddenly decides to change how their product or service works, how does it affect downstream actors? Relatedly, to make these AI supply chains more resilient, how should companies communicate with one another? There are questions around accountability. So Witter and Nafis in 2023 explore this sort of non-modularity of AI supply chains, and that you can't really separate how each individual party contributed. It's not so much, one party provided the window shades and another party provided the chairs and so on. They can combine in non-modular ways, which raises questions about accountability. And there are also questions around economics of the situation. So with some folks at MIT, including Luis, who is a trained economist, we looked at questions around market concentration, wrote a few short pieces. And this is work that we're kind of expanding and building. I'm going to focus on a perspective of this. So how does AI supply chain and its emergence complicate ML development, and how do ML decisions propagate through an AI supply chain? Any questions so far? All right, so I won't delve too much into this, but we have a little bit more in the paper on this model. Really, you can just think of AI supply chains as directed graphs, and this can be very, very useful for many reasons. The former example that I was talking about is this sort of four-node AI supply chain. You've got training data provider, the upstream base model provider trains on that data, the downstream fine-tuning model developers are training on some specialized data where they're fine-tuning this base model. And you can have various of these much more complicated AI supply chains. You can imagine this is sort of like a sub-network that exists in this broader ecosystem. And this is not new, right? This sort of directed graph type of modeling follows a long tradition of supply chain literature before AI. And doing this sort of modeling is helpful, and I won't go too much into it today, but it's helpful for studying things like what we call dispersed control. And you can think of dispersed control as the phenomenon of what happens when you put control over the ML pipeline into many different hands that don't necessarily communicate with another or share information. And so you can formalize it as, M dispersed control occurs when changes to an ancestor's operations, which we denote by H of A, where A denotes the ancestors, within M hops of a node V cannot be reversed by making any changes to the downstream node. So if your upstream actors make some change and you are this downstream actor, node V, you potentially might not have the ability, no matter what you do, to actually reverse those upstream changes unless you kind of design the whole system from scratch yourself. All right, so let's delve a little bit deeper into this with a few case studies. So the first case study is going to look at upstream decisions and their downstream consequences. And I think I've motivated this a little bit, but to be a little more explicit, upstream actors inevitably make design decisions, right? Whether or not you're making them explicitly or implicitly, they are design decisions. And downstream actors often have their own criteria. In fact, downstream actors, I would argue, are subject to further restrictions like regulations. They might operate in more specialized industries, so they have to actually satisfy these critical criteria. And it is impossible for us to expect upstream actors to accommodate all possible downstream criteria. That leads us to the question, how do upstream decisions affect downstream actors? And here we're going to focus on a specific type of upstream decision around algorithmic fairness. Before I go further, I want to talk a little bit about the related work. And because we're going to focus on fairness, we've got a few things related to that, but there's also been some work in other spaces. So for instance, the first work here talks about unlearning. It's quite interesting. It talks about how you might try to unlearn upstream. So let's say we ask OpenAI to unlearn somebody's information. They show that a downstream actor can relearn this information fairly quickly because unlearning is always inexact unless you are actually training the model from scratch. The second work also talks about how upstream decisions can be undone in a few different contexts. And then the last two look at how this similar notion can arise in fairness. So no fair representation can guarantee fairness under any downstream data distribution because designing fair representations was a push in the algorithmic fairness literature. And finally, this last work also talks about how fine-tuning downstream can erase pre-training biases. Okay, so we have this sort of like body of work that is saying fine-tuning downstream actions can reverse upstream ones. That's sort of this sort of theme in this related work. And we want to ask, is that always true? Is it true that you can erase like all possible impact of some upstream decision? And the setup we're going to look at has very simple base model and fine-tuned model. For simplicity, both the base model FP and fine-tuned model FV are going to take in the same input types of inputs X that belong to some our row space and output some scalar. So for instance, both of them take in applicant information and output scores of some sort. The way that we're going to think about upstream constraints, also for notation, if like you forget what we're talking about, P is always denoting parent and V is always denoting the node that we're like looking at right now. All right, so we're talking about upstream constraints and how they affect downstream decisions. So how are we going to formalize an upstream constraint? In this case study, we look at conditional independence constraints. So something of the form, the parent and its outputs are conditionally independent of some random variable x1 given some random variable z. And the reason that we do this is because conditional independence encompasses a lot of types of structured learning and restrictions or constraints. For example, in causal inference, where we have these structural causal models. And it also includes a lot of notions of algorithmic fairness, like equalized odds, where you would set Z to be the true outcome Y, and demographic parity, which is actually an unconditional notion of independence, so you would set Z to be the empty set. And then also in algorithmic fairness, you would think of X1 as a sensitive actor. So basically it's saying that conditioned on whatever information is provided by this random variable Z1, learning about your sensitive attribute does not improve your decision-making FP or affect your decision-making FP. Okay. All right, and then there are two more modeling choices that we make that are fairly common in this literature. The first is, this is how we model the parent base model. And we say that learning or training a base model FP of X is obtained by learning the mappings BI on X and weights WI. And the reason why we use this is a very common tool in the literature of studying ML from a theoretical perspective, because it's a universal function approximator as n goes to infinity under sufficiently rich basis functions. So you can think of like the Taylor approximation as actually being encompassed by this sort of form where the weights and then the transformation on X for each term. Okay. The second way that we study this is we're going to think of fine-tuning as learning a linear model, VI, set of VIs, on those embeddings VI that were learned by FP. So it's taking the same learned embeddings VI, plugging them in, and you're learning this. And this is also a fairly common way of studying fine-tuning. And in actually many cases, you not only, there are many cases where you fine-tune on the whole model, but many cases where you're just fine-tuning on the last layer or last embedding. And this is a good approximation of that. Any questions? Okay, so what's our result? Let's suppose that your upstream model FP satisfies some notion of conditional independence as you wanted it to, and it's always with respect to some data distribution mu. And let's assume pretty reasonably, hopefully, that this base model is also trained with some sort of sparsely regularizer, let's say the L1 sparsely regularizer on those mappings phi I. Then if the basis functions are sufficiently rich and non-redundant, the condition is right here, sufficiently rich and non-redundant, then you have this condition on your fine-tuned model. So it implies that your fine-tuned model in expectation matches your fine-tuned model when you're conditioning on slightly different events. Okay, so what does this mean? If you recall that conditional independence is actually this exact thing, but if you replace this with probability, this is saying that conditional independence upstream is going to have some effect on your model downstream, but it's not quite conditional independence. It's not that just that it inherits conditional independence. It's kind of a first moment version of it because you're doing it on expectations. Okay, there's the though equal sometimes, and that's kind of important because actually this sort of first moment notion of independence or mean independence and full conditional independence are actually equivalent in some cases where you're doing classification. All right, so what's the takeaway? We can kind of see two things if we think about the related work that we were talking about. One is that it does have some effect for sure. Either it's exactly equal when it's the nice classification cases, or it's a first moment version of conditional independence that is being passed downstream. But we had all these works before that said, actually, you can often like undo what an upstream decision maker decides by fine tuning. So how can we reconcile these two things? And really it comes from one, the fact that you can never fully exactly get this conditional independence. You'll get approximate conditional independence, but also that this is like a weaker condition downstream. All right, so this is nice. There's sort of a theoretical result. We want some more intuition, so why don't we do some experiments and actually get a sense of how much does that like approximation error in requesting or constraining to conditional independence upstream affect this statement. Okay, so to do this experiment, we have simple setup, base model, fine-tuned model, FP and FV. We do the experiments on a data set called waterbirds, and we use ResNet 18. Waterbirds, if you haven't encountered before, is a very nice fairness data set. It's commonly used in fairness, even though it's about birds. And the basic setup is you have two types of birds. You have land birds and you have water birds. So you're trying to classify land and water, but you also have backgrounds, and those backgrounds are also either land or water. And you can, expect that there's some correlation between when you see a land bird on land versus a land bird on water and so on. And so obviously you see more land birds on land and more water birds on water, but truly the background shouldn't affect the actual true identity of the bird. So this is why it's a common fairness data set. Okay. The loss that we're training on is just simple. We're binary cross entropy loss on F plus some regularizer on fairness. And this is how we're going to impose this sort of upstream constraint of regularizer on fairness mediated by this coefficient alpha. Okay, so this is the loss that we're dealing with. We're going to use three types of fairness or explore three types of fairness. First is demographic parity. The formal definitions don't matter too much, but demographic parity basically says that you want the same selection rate for two groups where the groups are divided based on sensitive attribute. Equalized FPR asks for the false positive rate of the groups to be the same, and equalized odds asks for both the false positive rate and the true positive rate for the groups to be the same. We vary both alpha during training of the base model and alpha during training of the fine-tuning model. So those are just going to be denoted by alpha base and alpha fine-tuning in the regularization constraint. And we trained over 10,000 models. Okay, so what's our result? I'm going to show two slides with approximately the same sort of layout. On the y-axis is accuracy. On the x-axis will always be fairness gap, but we're going to explore two types of fairness gaps. So we're going to look at equalized FPR on the left and demographic parity on the right. So worst fairness gap, the worst level of fairness is a higher fairness gap. And then what we're looking at are three colors. The colors denote what the base model was trained with. So if you trained with demographic parity as your regularizer in the base model, then it's green. Equalized FPR, then it's orange. Equalized odds, then it's blue. And left and right denotes or separates whether you fine-tuned with a certain fairness regularizer, equalized FPR, or the fairness regularizer, demographic parity. Good? Okay. All right, so this is a super overwhelming plot, and the next one will kind of draw conclusions from this. But this is sort of just visualizing what it looks like when we train these 10,000 models. So we train these 10,000 models, each of these dots denotes a model. So it denotes a fine-tuned model. So this is something that was trained with base fairness demographic parity and fine-tuned with equalized FPR under some alpha base and some alpha fine-tuning. And that's true for all of these. All of our models can be put on this sort of 2D plot. And same for the right-hand side. Okay, so this, how do we make sense of this like very, very messy plot? What you want to do is take the Pareto frontiers. And so effectively what we did here is look for the models that were furthest to the left and furthest up, because you want the Pareto frontier to be the highest accuracy and the lowest fairness gap. And these types of plots start to give us really, really interesting results. And so this first result is on fine-tuning on the full network. So this is even like more difficult in terms of the result that I presented to you theoretically earlier, because if you fine-tune on the full network, it's much easier to undo upstream actions. And we're showing here that even fine-tuning on the full network, you get this residual result of an upstream decision. And the residual result is that you're shifting the Pareto frontier. That means that you're imposing a greater trade-off between performance and fairness downstream. And this is like sorry, I'm going to turn off my phone. This is non-obvious because you can imagine if I took this, every blue dot, and I projected it downwards onto this axis, or I projected it this way onto the y-axis, and every orange dot, and so on. And so this is, if you just plotted accuracy or fairness, you would actually not observe any statistically significant changes, meaning that whether you trade on demographic parity, equalized FPR, or equalized odds, it would look like you can undo every previous action because you don't get a statistically significant difference between your ability to achieve fairness downstream. But when you look at the Pareto frontiers, you see that it's effectively imposing a trade-off, meaning that if I base train with equalized FPR and I fine-tune with equalized FPR, I face a lower trade-off, this orange line, than I face with demographic parity or with equalized odds as my base model. And we can see this trend emphasized even further when you're just fine-tuning on the last layer. And so these actually start to get farther and farther apart. So you face worse and worse trade-off, the less control you have downstream. I want to say that like a lot of APIs actually only let you fine-tune on the last layer. So this is like a more realistic setting. Okay, so the implications are upstream constraints have downstream consequences, and it's not quite straightforward. Your downstream models don't simply inherit upstream properties. This is what we were showing with the theoretical result. And our experiments show that you actually can undo them. So if you notice, if I fine tune, I can actually achieve a pretty close to zero equalized FPR fairness gap. So I can undo them. It's just that I face a higher performance fairness trade-off. I'm going to move on to case study 2. Any questions? Yeah.
Just a clarification, the 10,000 models, is just like different samples of the data? Or
yeah. It's actually, the samples are the same. The data is the same. We keep the seed same. It's different initializations. Yeah.
So in the base model and the fine-tuning model, they both have access to the exact same data? Like the
yes. Yep.
Samples.
Yep, exactly.
I guess are there cases where that is representative of how fine-tuning, like they might use like a smaller number of samples? Or, like,
oh no, the base model and fine-tuning model don't have access to the same samples. It's across experiments, everything is kept the same with respect to data. And the only change is the initializations that you use for the base model, and then we fine-tune on that base model. But no, we actually use never overlapping data, and we vary the distribution shift in our experiments as well. Okay. All right. Second case study, we're going to look at information propagation in the AI supply chain. Motivation is supply chains spread knowledge across multiple actors. Someone might be like curating the data, someone might be training the model, someone might be fine tuning, and so on. And so what are the implications of what we call like this dispersed knowledge? And the way that we're going to look at this is through explainability, explanations of AI decisions. So the setup, and I'll formalize this a little bit more, is let's say you have a company. This is the downstream company that needs to provide explanations of its model decisions, maybe in lending and education or so on, and hiring. But the company is built on an AI supply chain, so it uses the outputs of other models as inputs to its own model. I think it's really important here to just note that the supply chain setup here is a little bit different. You're not fine tuning, you're using the outputs of upstream models to make your decisions. So it's like if I'm a hiring company and I use a tool that processes resumes and that gives me some information, summarization information, I use that to make my decision. That's sort of this setup that we're dealing with here. And the downstream company needs to generate end-to-end explanations, meaning it needs to explain relative to the input, relative to the applicant, how it made its decision, not relative to the upstream actor. But the company does not have access to the upstream AI models, right? They're trade secrets. They're not going to let you probe. Okay, so this is a setup. Formally, you've got an applicant X again, your organization downstream is V, and your decision is some FV of X. And let's say we have this simple setup where organization V receives some applicant X, and it's using two upstream models or two upstream decision score generators, P1 and P2. So downstream organization is going to send the applicant information up to P1 and up to P2. P1 and P2 are going to process this applicant information and then send some scores, Z1 and Z2 back. And then V is then going to use the score sent by P1 and P2 to produce its output FV of X. Okay. All right, so where does the explainability part come from? Because organization V is using third-party tools, effectively what's happening is FV of X is this sort of composition, HV of X, the output Z1, so FP1 of X, and up all the way up to some like Fn of X that it's receiving from its parents. We're going to think of explanations in this form. We're going to call them this class of locally linear explanations. So locally linear explanation, delta explanation for some model G at some instance Z is denoted by E delta G comma Z. And it's that explanation, now I'll explain a little bit more, that minimizes M with respect to this L2 norm. Okay, so what's happening on the right-hand side here? You can think of this as E delta G of Z is like the Jacobian. So I take a locally linear approximation of what the landscape looks like around Z, but we don't actually want just the Jacobian because normally these functions themselves, these models are actually very spiky, very noisy. And so what you want is a smooth version of a linear explanation at some point Z. And that's what this is doing. It's taking, it's drawing U uniformly at random in this neighborhood around Z. And then it's saying, what is the best locally linear explanation within this neighborhood? And the reason we like this is this type of explanation encompasses a lot of popular approaches such as LIME. And there is a lot of debate around LIME. I got this question the last time I gave this talk. And so not everyone loves these locally linear type of approaches, but it is actually something that I've observed and talked to folks about that appears a lot in the industry. Okay, so if we go back to our setup, B has two parents. It's sending applicant information up. These parents are sending some information back down. We're going to add that the information that is sent back down also includes explanations. So your upstream parents, your upstream actors are sending explanations of their decisions down to you because you're required to explain your decision. And so they need to tell you at least a little bit about how they're making their decisions. Does this make sense? The main issue is that explanations are empirically approximated, right? You can't actually minimize that quantity that we had on the previous slide exactly. So you empirically approximate it. And so we end up with these E hats here. And so in the end, downstream organization B is using E hats from its parents, plus its own explanation, which it can potentially compute exactly to produce its ultimate end-to-end explanation, E hat FE of X. Okay. What we want to show now is that explanation accuracy degrades. So the way that we're going to model this is the supply chain has an ancestor tree for V that is M regular with depth D. So that's what the ancestors for V look like. And that in this information sharing, each ancestor A computes an explanation, but that explanation has some degree of error given by delta A for each ancestor A, where the entries of this delta A are independent with variance epsilon. If this is true, then you can show that quite simply that the explanation error can grow at the rate epsilon m to the d. And this is reminiscent and consistent with some previous work that dates back all the way even to like 1967. It's really about sort of error propagation downstream. Some folks think of it's sort of related to the bullwhip effect, which was discussed a lot during the pandemic, which talks about how small changes in a supply chain can propagate throughout the network. And there's also a work that talks about how differences in explanation fidelity can also lead to unfairness, a little bit out of the supply chain context, but related. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is talk about the experimental setup, but I want to make sure that so far things are clear. All we've been saying so far is that explanation fidelity can degrade as you produce explanations downstream. And really, that's actually what's going to happen. The downstream actors are the ones who have to produce explanations themselves. Okay, so for experimental setup, we have these applicants who have 10-dimensional features. We sample them from multivariate Gaussian, a very, very simple setting. Labels are generated using a noisy linear model. We're going to look at even the simplest supply chain, which is just a linear supply chain from lengths 1 to 5. Each model, to simulate the supply chain learning, we're going to have each model learn independently, but the way that it learns depends on the predictions of its parents. So this creates a sort of step-by-step progression. And models are simple. They're these MLPs with 3 fully connected layers, value activation. We did regression, so MSC is our loss with an atom optimizer and so on. And then consistent with our locally linear explanations, we use this off-the-shelf method LIME for generating explanations. Okay, so I'm going to show 2 types of results. First on the left is going to look at cosine similarity between the estimated explanation and the true explanation. The estimated explanation is the explanation you would produce given this information from your parents. And the true explanation is what you could have produced if you were developing everything in-house, and so you could probe the models yourself and generate a full end-to-end explanation yourself. What we see going down the supply chain length, and again, this is a really simple supply chain, so the easiest setting, it's just a linear one, is that the range of overlap between the true explanation and the supply chain one gets larger as you increase the length. And so some of them are actually quite accurate. There's a lot of cosine similarity, but the worst case scenarios get increasingly worse. Okay, so this is kind of maybe like a naive insight that we would have expected. Let's maybe take it one step further, because what we care about in explanations is usually something called recourse. Recourse is this idea that what is the point of explanations? Point of explanations is to provide someone the ability to actually change their outcome. So if I'm denied a loan, what are the actions I need to take to actually be successfully apply for a loan next time? And so we can think of recourse using this framework that has started to arise. One of the folks who proposed it were Wachter, Mittelstadt, and Russell in 2017, which is thinking about recourse as how far an applicant would need to move along the direction indicated by an explanation in order to flip their prediction, to flip their outcome. And here we see something potentially more interesting, which is that when you get this estimated explanation, the amount of recourse, the amount of action you need to take increases, because the sort of directionality of that explanation actually has a significant impact on you. And this is only for, I believe, the supply chain of length 3, so corresponds to this one. And so you can see that, and we show this in the paper, that the amount of recourse, the amount of effort you need to put in increases significantly with the supply chain length. Okay, all right, so that's all I have on supply chains. I'll move on, unless there are any questions. Yes.
Is there intuition for why the estimated one should be more distance, like, I guess I would expect it to be off from the true one, but that wouldn't necessarily be one more distance.
Yeah, exactly. I don't actually, it's a good question. I don't think we delved that deeply into why. Because yeah, even you wouldn't, you would expect some error in this one and maybe potentially more error in this one, but hopefully that error is unbiased. If it's unbiased, then you'd see this gap start to close. So I'm not sure why, but this is, yeah, the general pattern that we observed. It's a good question.
Is there any global data on the supply chain?
You mean like real world data?
Yes.
That's a great question. That's what I'm trying to work on at Stanford right now. So we're trying to use public information to actually map out supply chains, because there are a lot of like hypotheses of like, you know, who is, there are a lot of hypotheses that Anthropic, for instance, supplies mostly to enterprises, and ChatGPT and OpenAI supplies to certain types of consumers. And so we're starting to try to like map out what this supply chain actually looks like, and then what are the downstream consequences there, so we can make it a little more grounded. Okay, the second work I want to talk about is totally new work, still ongoing. And this is ongoing work with Ananya, who's a research fellow at Stanford, and my two co-advisors, Daniel Ho and Percy Young. And here, what we're really motivated by is that there might be plaintiffs, there might be individuals who are seeking recourse somehow via our legal system. But when they do so, they actually face significant boundaries to winning a case. Okay, so to lay that out a little bit more clearly, our legal system operates on burden of proof. For instance, most folks are familiar with criminal cases, which apply the well-known guilty beyond a reasonable doubt standard. In a previous paper, another student, Rohan, and I connected this to hypothesis testing. So you can think of like the null hypothesis as establishing who bears the burden of proof. And what this asks usually is that there's some individual who must prove something beyond some standard, and then sometimes the burden of proof shifts to the other party, but you kind of have this flip-flopping, and the law, case law, and statutes have kind of set out what the procedure for this looks like. And in this work, we want to ask, can we close the gap on evidentiary burdens, especially if you are bringing a case against an AI determination or AI decision? And for simplicity, we're going to look at Title VII as a case study, just because there's such a beautiful and rich body of literature here. All right, brief intro to Title VII. Title VII of the U.S. Civil Rights Act prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. There is a very complex set of procedures around Title VII, but for simplicity, I'm going to simplify as follows, which is often what is done in the computer science literature, which is we've got 3 steps. The first step is the plaintiff, so the one who's bringing the lawsuit, needs to establish something known as a disparate impact, which is sort of like a measure of discrimination. So this typically in the algorithmic case involves showing that female applicants, for instance, receive worse outcomes than on average than male applicants, and you can complicate this sort of definition as needed. Quantifying the disparate impact in algorithmic cases has been the subject of 10+ years of research and is not the focus of today. All right, so let's say you are the defendant and you do establish disparate impact, so you show some sort of statistical notion of discrimination in outcomes. The defendant, the employer, can actually respond by showing something called business necessity, meaning they can say, yes, we did discriminate, or our outcomes are discriminatory, but that is actually for a business reason. And the classical case that people like to talk about, and I can't remember the details, but there's a woman who applied for, I believe, a police academy, and she brought a suit saying that she felt that she was discriminated against on the basis of sex. She was able to prove this first step. The burden of proof shifts to the defendant, and the police academy or police force, I don't remember, said, yes, well, actually, you know, strength and agility and so on are actually really important for our police force, but also those that we're protecting. And so this outcome discrepancy occurs for business necessity reasons. All right, so if they're able to sufficiently establish business necessity, the burden of proof shifts back to the plaintiff. And this is the third and final step. So the person trying to prove discrimination has to acknowledge, yes, there's discrimination. That discrimination occurred for business necessity reasons. And the final thing that they do is prove that there's a less discriminatory alternative. And that's the exact wording. And what is meant by this is that, sure, you might need to discriminate on the basis of sex, but actually what you could do, you could have done better. You could have reduced discrimination and still met business necessity. And so in the case involving the woman in the police force, I believe what she did was suggest that they just implement a strength and agility type of test. And that way you're actually testing for what you care about and not making that inference based off of sex. Okay. All right. This, however, less discriminatory alternative is the focus of our work. And our main claim, which has been observed in other works before us, is that this is a tall order for AI systems, right? So a straightforward interpretation is that the plaintiff must produce an algorithm that performs just as well, but is less discriminatory. And that is the subject of a lot of people's entire PhD theses. And so the two reasons why this burden is typically very high is actually two things. One is that, yeah, sure, they have limited expertise and resources. Maybe they're able to hire someone though. So I think actually the one that really hurts is actually that you have limited knowledge of the system, meaning the employer often can claim that the technology, which is usually a third-party tool, is a trade secret, so they don't reveal it to you. So you can't take a model and then probe it and try to find directions where it's still high performing but less discriminatory. And you yourself often don't have access to the data. So again, limited knowledge of the system, maybe for privacy reasons, and so you can't train your own models. I want to note that there are some pieces that argue to just shift the burden of proof. They say, why not just put this burden, this last one, on employers, so they are the ones who are obligated to argue that you cannot find a less discriminatory alternative. And that's potentially possible. I would argue that we still need to think very closely about this problem for two reasons. One is that when I do talk to lawyers, they say that it's very unlikely, though possible, that longstanding statute on procedure will change because AI is just one of a sort of new technology, and this statute has stood the test of time. But the second is that even if we do put the burden of proof on the employer, we still want to verify that. They might claim, yeah, we did the best that we could, and there's no LDA, no less discriminatory alternative, but we still have to hold them accountable for that claim. And so we still need tools to kind of investigate. Okay, all right, so what we're doing in this work is we're leveraging Pareto frontiers to really actually observe this a little bit more closely and study a little more closely. And the observation is based off of this. The employer's argument to reduce disparate impact, the AI system must sacrifice performance, is basically a claim that the AI system is sufficiently close to the Pareto frontier. So hopefully the last part of the talk warmed us up for Pareto frontiers. But the way to think about this is as follows. Again, let's say you have loss. This is different from last time. Actually, we had accuracy on this axis, but now we have loss. But the x-axis is the same. You have a fairness gap. Let's say this is the AI system. So steps 1 and steps 2 of the legal procedure establish that there's a fairness gap. So it actually gives you the x coordinate. And then the step 2 of the legal procedure established that there's some business necessity, some performance thing that you're trying to reach. The employer desired loss. So that actually gives you the y coordinate. So you actually kind of have this xy coordinate by the time you get to step 3. All right, so why are Pareto frontiers important? Note that better Pareto frontiers move bottom and to the left, lower loss, lower fairness gap. Let's say the Pareto frontier is here, given by this orange line, which would mean that the AI system falls on this orange line, falls on the Pareto frontier. That means that in order for the model, any model, to improve fairness, they necessarily have to decrease loss. So there's like a gap, a trade-off. But if the Pareto frontier is actually this red line, that implies that there's this potential improvement at the same loss where you could decrease the fairness gap. Anything in this entire region, or I guess mostly this region, but here you can lower the loss further. Okay, so far so good. All right, so that implies that if the plaintiff argues that the AI system is pretty far from the Pareto frontier, then they'd be done. I'm hiding some, details. We need to caveat about like reasonableness, and there's sort of a gap, but for understanding this is effectively the world that we're operating in. So how would the plaintiff find the Pareto frontier? This is actually really hard, right? So the typical way to find a Pareto frontier is what we talked about in the first part of the talk. You typically design a bunch of systems. Each system corresponds to an X. You plot all the X's on some loss, fairness gap plane. And then you take those that are farthest down to the left and you kind of connect them. You say the Pareto frontier is probably this. It's always a conservative estimate, right? Like the Pareto frontier could be even further. But this is the best Pareto frontier that you were able to obtain with your training. Okay, why is this bad? Well, this is hard, right? Like to train each one of these, you need access to compute, to data, and you need expertise to train a system. So we're actually back where we started. Finding the Pareto frontier seems just as hard as finding the LDA itself. Okay, so that's the core of the thing that we're trying to break. And we show that we can do better. We can actually characterize the shape of the Pareto frontier for one thing. And this is good because actually Pareto frontiers need not have this nice shape. They can, it's possible they actually look like this in between these axes that you've found. And so a defendant sufficiently motivated could argue actually the Pareto frontier that you've drawn is really faulty. The second thing is we show that you can extrapolate the true Pareto frontier from much easier tasks. So meaning that it will be much easier than training state-of-the-art systems. So what we're trying to do here is say, let's say you train much smaller models on much smaller data sets. You might be able to get these X's, which form a Pareto frontier as such. And you get information that says the employer's algorithm or the model they used and the data set they used is much larger. And you can actually extrapolate what their Pareto frontier looks like. So this is the concept that we're building on. Does that make sense? The way that some people like to put this is a sort of scaling law for what the Pareto frontier looks like. If that helps. Okay. Our main result, I think, is really exciting. Let's say you have X, A, Y, which are the random variables denoting the covariate, sensitive attribute, and the outcome, respectively. You have binary cost entropy on some model F on some distribution P. You have some training data set D and some fairness gap delta. A lot of this notation won't be that important. I'll point out what's important. And in our setting, which is just the first pass, but I believe we can relax a lot of these, the source of unfairness that we examine is selection bias. And so what I mean by that is in the employment case, we might believe that truly sex does not have an direct impact on your ability to be a good police officer. It's actually due to, if you know that, they have strong strength and agility, and qualify in other ways, then this extra sensitive attribute should not actually impact it. And what causes this demographic discrimination is usually due to selection bias in the training data. Okay, if we are under this mode of operation, this is the sort of informal version of the theorem. And I want to point out a few things that are important. First is that this is an approximation, and it's mostly due to high probability statements. And that's really important because it's not an upper bound or a lower bound, which would make it really hard to characterize a Pareto frontier, because the whole point of Pareto frontier is to kind of characterize that like sharp trade-off that you're experiencing. And the second is that we have 5 constants: C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. And 4 of these constants, other than C4, do not depend on F, which is your model class, and D, which is your training data set. Okay, so why is this important? This says, this is BC, this is loss. So that was the y-axis. This is delta, this is the x-axis. This gives you the shape of the curve with 5 constants. And 4 of them don't depend on model class and data set, meaning that you can fit C1, C2, C3, and C5 on much smaller data sets and much smaller model classes. And then you just need to infer the relationship for C4. And inferring this is actually the topic of other people's research in scaling laws. Like you can kind of plug and play here. And that's, I think, what I'm going to say here. 5 constants, 4 don't depend on F and D. So we can fit 4 constants on small models and data sets, which helps address the resource and expertise problem. And for C4, we can use scaling laws. Okay, so this is ongoing work. This is our first main result, but we're trying to extend the Pareto frontier calculation to not only different types of unfairness. So we looked at demographic parity, but also different sources of unfairness. And we have done experiments with very promising results, but we're still trying to figure out, when does it extrapolate well, when does it not extrapolate well? And so thoughts and feedback are very welcome. So I'll just close here and say that we're motivated by sort of two different perspectives today. One is, how do we adjust our understanding of AI to its integration into society? And how do we adjust our understanding of society as it integrates AI? And we looked at both these perspectives by studying AI supply chains first and studying evidentiary burden second. So that's it. Thank you so much for coming. Sure.
To get us started. For the legal side, I'm having no background at all. Is loss seen as like a valid measure of utility in legal proceedings? Like, if we could show the loss is maintained, is that enough, or is that just one part of the argument?
I've seen accuracy certainly used in different cases, actually one that had nothing to do with employment, but recidivism. Not recidivism, sorry, sentencing. So I do know that companies will point to these specific metrics and performance measures in legal cases. Accuracy is much, much harder to study than loss because it's not smooth. Like it's whether or not you're the class that you predicted matches the exact class, which is usually like if it's not regression, then it's not smooth. And so the best we can do in these types of cases is study loss. And so my hope is that that will be a good proxy for accuracy. Thanks.
Maybe a socio-technical question.
Sure.
But I'm curious if there's, from the legal side also, there's pushback in terms, I think some of this is furthering maybe an assumption that fairness is like at a trade-off to accuracy or like
Sure.
a constraint and limiting the other thing that maybe we do care about, like accuracy or loss.
Sure.
Like, is there this like ideal world where we can improve both
Yeah.
for some of these decisions?
That's a good question. I would say that it's actually kind of baked into the law that you have a trade-off because of this sort of like type of three-part argument that you're showing discrimination, someone's saying it's actually for business necessity, you're coming with a less discriminatory alternative. And what we're doing is probably more so actually like saying that trade-off is maybe a little looser than you think it is, that the greater frontier is further out and you have a little bit more wiggle room than you're trying to claim. So I think it's a good observation. And like I think the example that's commonly referred to with the sort of woman in police force or police academy is a good one to your point of saying like actually it's not so much about discrimination and sex, you can just measure the right things and it seems like less of a trade-off once you do that.
You said you were looking like ongoing is a little bit more deal. What's that? Actually,
Oh, for this?
yeah.
We're trying to basically determine whether this is true. So given different types of setups, like let's say you have to curate your own data and design your own small models to get this orange curve, or maybe you're able to get 10% of anonymized data from the employer. So different types of setups, we want to explore like how well can you actually approximate where the Pareto frontier falls. Because we have the ability to like scale up those experiments and look at ground truth because it's sort of more a synthetic scenario. We can like get a sense of, is this a reasonable method to take or under what conditions is it reasonable?
So be much more on the company side than just has focus data.
Yeah, exactly.
if no other questions, oh,
Yeah, I think the third part of that standard is really interesting because it doesn't really make an argument that it's an avenue to like get more access to a government system. Like if the burden is on the plaintiff to find
Exactly.
a different system that's less discriminatory, shouldn't they be allowed to like really probe
Yeah.
the system? Or like if it's hard to extrapolate some parts, then they need more access. Like,
Yeah.
Do you think that's an interesting avenue to like get more access?
Yeah, no, that's actually, I totally agree, because that's actually 100% the motivation of this work. Like there are some previous works and discussions on LDAs, and what they're doing is trying to find LDAs. But they usually assume that you have access to the model. And so you're doing a thing of like, this is where the model is, can we probe in the right ways? Or like, what is the like equivalent set? We're really motivated by like, either this is a sort of argument that you might be able to put forward to argue for discovery, because the courts can't grant indiscriminate access to everyone who says, I think there's a better alternative. And so we need at least a little bit of help to get to that first process of saying like, this is a first pass showing there's probably a less discriminatory alternative. Can you give us more access? And the motivation of using a sort of scaling law is saying that for scaling laws, you don't need to know like everything about how something was trained. You just need to know a few things about like the size of the model, the size of their training data set, stuff like that. And by plugging in these key pieces of information that hopefully they're more willing to provide, you can approximate the Pareto frontier and then like slowly progress to motivating increasing forms of access. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you talked to lawyers about this, if you have any sense of what they